welcome to the Polgar Chess University. Let's see some critical positions that I witnessed from the recently concluded Spice Spring Invitational tournament. Here is the first example, which is a variation from a game played right in the first round. What do we see going on in this position? Well, we see that the white king is in a bit safer position than black's, and the white pieces are ready to attack, with the white queen already on the 7th rank, the bishop aiming towards the king side, and the white rook ready to get to the f-file. Things look well for white. In addition, the two pawns on e5 and g5 can also be valuable assets for white's attack. Well, the bottom line is we need to look for ways to make progress, because a nice position is great to have, but we need to convert it to a full point. So I suggest you give it a thought and try to figure out how white should continue here. White should play immediately e6. This is a key move because it aims to destroy the key defender, the f7 pawn, for the black king. So now white has two threats. One, to simply advance the pawn further ahead to e7 to threaten to promote the pawn, in addition to, in some cases, capture the pawn on f7. Of course, another additional hidden threat is that the white rook may come to f1 sometimes in the near future, chasing the queen away from the f-file and then enabling the white queen to capture on f7. You may wonder, why didn't white play rook to f1 right away? Well, the simple answer to that is that black would have the opportunity to retreat the queen to d5 in a way where it kind of hangs on to everything. Protects the pawn on f7 still protects the bishop on b7, and of course the bishop on b7 in turn protects the queen also on d5. I'd like to point out that capturing white's bishop on d3, on the other hand, would not be a good choice for various reasons. One simple reason would be because the queen could capture the rook that is, or at least was, pinning white's pawn on c2, and then the black queen will be lost. In addition to that, white has another option, as we shall see in the main variation, that queen f7 actually is an even better choice. But let's go back here, because as we said, after the immediate rook f1, the black queen would retreat to d5 and black would be hanging on. So the correct and most effective choice is to play e6. Black captured the pawn on e6, and now white would play rook f1. The big difference is that now if the black queen goes to d5, as we said in the initial variation, then already the white queen will be ready to go to f7, chasing the black king to the corner, and there of course on the open h-file it will be soon checkmated. At the same time, if the queen captures on d3 right now, white is winning in numerous ways. As we said, white could just capture the rook on c8, but much better is actually to check, and after king h8, now the key idea is rook h1. The point being that if the bishop captures, then queen takes rook, no more pinning rook on the c-file, and then the queen falls. On the other hand, if black does not capture the rook in the corner, but moves out of the check, then a simple two-move checkmate follows, with queen f6, followed by rook h8. Wow, very nice attack. Let's move on to a bit more complicated example. Here we are. This is another position that could have been reached from one of the games from the Spice tournament. It was black's turn in this position, and this is an absolutely key position, because if black does not find the correct move, black actually is the one getting in trouble. We can see how the black knight on g6 is already in a very annoying and unpleasant pin. Moreover, white has a very serious threat in threatening to move the bishop to f8 and pin the black queen as well. Remember, the black knight is already in a pin, so therefore that bishop f8 move is a very serious and devastating threat for black. So let's see a couple of options what black may try to do to get out of that problem. If black would try to move the king simply out of that threat, of that bishop f8 threat, then white would just capture the pawn on f3 and force the king back to h6, and then be ready with the same idea, bishop f8. If in this position black would try to give a check immediately on c7, white could simply respond to that by blocking it with the rook, and now the black knight is under dual attack, and moreover that would be a checkmate threat. So black would not achieve anything by giving this check, only delay the end. Now let's look at an alternative if black tries to play rook to a5 right now, pinning the white bishop. True, now bishop f8 no longer works, because then the black rook will capture white's queen, and for example, after the resulting position, rook takes queen, bishop takes, king takes, it is black who is a piece ahead. So after rook a5, which certainly serves well defending against the bishop f8 pin, white needs to do something different, and white actually can still win the game here, namely by a very cute little sacrifice, giving the rook up. Now there is a forceful move, check, and then on the next move simply grab the free rook. For example, after king h7, queen takes, and white is in a winning position. Let's go back and think again what may be still the move that turns things around and gives black a superior position. Well, amazingly, that move is, and if you choose, I suggest take some time and try to figure out this magical move on your own before you listen further. And hopefully you did, and now you're back, and let's see what's the move. It's to play f2. Pretty amazing move, putting the pawn under dual attack. The queen or the bishop could capture it, and moreover ignoring the threat of bishop f8. So let's first start what would happen if indeed the bishop does go to f8, pinning the black queen. If now black promotes his pawn to a queen, for example, then white would checkmate right away on one move by capturing the black knight with a queen. The beautiful part is that black now can and should promote the pawn to a knight. This is pretty impressive, and it's a rare occasion when you'd want to under-promote your pawn, meaning you would promote it to a lower value piece than the queen. So now white is in a check, and that's the main purpose of the move, to gain time. If the king moves out of the check now the black knight is ready to jump to g3, which is a discovered check, attacking the white queen. And if the king goes to h2, then things end real quick after the immediate checkmate. Or if the king goes the other way to f2, then black would just capture the queen and be 2 knights ahead after the disappearance of the queens. A beautiful, beautiful variation. Let's go all the way back, and after f2 see some other options for white. Instead of bishop f8, white could certainly try capturing the pawn on f2. For example, let's start with the bishop capture. That's pretty easy to refute, because after the queen c7 check, as we can see, the white king has nowhere to go, and because of that white needs to block the check. And after g3, the pawn is ready to capture on g3. And now, if bishop captures back, the rook is falling on b6. And otherwise, if the king moves out of the check, then yet another beautiful combination to unpin the knight, which is right now in a pin. Black right now would capture the rook on b6, so the knight is no longer in a pin, and then after bishop takes queen, knight fork, winning the queen. Quite impressive. One more time. After f2, we saw already bishop f8. We saw what happens after bishop captures the pawn on f2, and now let's see what happens if the queen does the same, capturing the pawn on f2. Now, things are a bit different. The check needs to come from e5, so the white rook would be unable to block it, unlike if the queen would go to c7 instead. So now the only reasonable move is to block the check with the pawn. And here black has several ways to go. The natural and simple way is to simply take on g3, forcing the queen to recapture, and then grab the bishop, leaving black with an extra knight. Of course, this is not a bad choice, but not the best either, because in this position black can do actually even better by threatening with immediate checkmate after queen d5. There is a checkmate threat in the corner with either queen or rook, so white pretty much has to play queen g2, preventing that. Then pawn takes. Now if the queen takes back, then the checkmate arrives on h1, so king needs to capture back. And now again the queen could capture the bishop, but white is in bigger trouble than that. After queen e5 check, white cannot avoid either losing the queen or getting checkmated real quick. For example, if king g4, queen f4 checkmate, or after king f3, black would continue with a simple check on f5, and king e3, grab the bishop, and then the rook, and black's material advantage is overwhelming. Finally, let's go back to the position after f2 and conclude that actually white's best choice is to try to get rid of the knight, and now either trade queens or capture rather with the queen on f2 immediately, and try to survive this endgame where obviously black is an exchange up for a pawn, and black has winning chances, but white has drawing chances as well. A very, very fascinating middle game position with a lot of tactics going on. You can see how rich chess is in beauty and in different tactical elements. Let's move on to a simpler situation which was played in an actual game. That position was reached after just 18 moves, and it was black's turn. Looks like a very normal position from a King's Indian defense, where not even a single piece or pawn has been exchanged so far. Black is clearly attacking with his queen on g5 and knight on f4, aiming at the g2 pawn to checkmate, but at the moment the white bishop is safely protecting it, so it seems like everything is under control for white. Sadly for white, this is not quite the case. In this position, with black to move, black can gain material advantage immediately. take advantage of the fact that the white knight is very unfortunately positioned on d2. Why? Because a knight on d2, as amazing as it is, has not a single possible move. Well, with this hint, I suggest you take some time and try to figure out the winning move for black. And the move is moving the knight from c5 to d3. Looks like a harmless move, but it's not. It threatens with a fork to bring the knight to f2 and check the king and attack the rook. Obviously, it cannot be captured by the bishop from f1 because then already the checkmate would arrive with queen takes g2. And as I said, amazingly, the white knight cannot move anywhere from d2. If it could, then the white queen would get to protect from c2 that key f2 square, but the knight from d2 has no place, and therefore white cannot prevent losing the exchange. For example, if the king would move to g1, the problem would be the other knight arriving to h3, and then after king h1, checkmate with a knight from d3. Beautiful. The game actually continued after knight d3 with white playing g3 here. Instead of king g1, g3, allowing the fork and giving up on the exchange. And now the game continued with knight h5, and after many more moves and inaccuracies of black, white managed to survive and draw the game. But in the meantime, we can conclude that black won an exchange, and that's a very significant advantage. Let's move on to our next example, which is another game played in the same tournament, and it was black's turn in this position. Black has earlier sacrificed a pawn on the queen side, so white is a pawn up, but white has not very good coordination between the pieces. To start with, white is behind in development in that the bishop on c1 is still undeveloped. Also, the other bishop on f1 developed backwards. Once it already was on g2 developed, but had to come back later to f1. So white has issues going on, and then the queen, of course, on d3, protecting the knight. It's usually not the greatest thing to have a queen in front of a bishop. And because the bishop on c1 is undeveloped, white also has a rook unprotected on a1. So it's a lot of things going on, and black has the famous King's Indian bishop hiding but getting ready to be in action. And the time arrived for black to make a combination to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. I suggest you take some time and try to figure out what's that move that makes it all work for black. And the answer to that question is knight takes pawn on e4. Looks like a silly move. The queen or the rook can capture. Reality is that, for example, if rook captures, black will follow it up by playing f5, attacking the rook, and if that rook moves away, then advance the e-pawn. And here is the magical King's Indian bishop on g7, now immediately attacking the rook in the corner, and of course the white queen and knight are already in a fork. So it's certainly that black would come out ahead from this deal. After knight captured on e4, white's response in the game was to rather capture back with the queen. But the drawback of this choice was that now the other knight on b5 is unprotected. Of course, the black queen hangs on to the bishop on b5. In the meantime, black won the pawn back, and the f5 e4 threat is still rather dangerous because When that happens, the black bishop will open up and attack the rook in the corner, while the white knight on f3 will be also under attack. White continued by moving the queen to h4 out of all these troubles even before black would play f5 himself. Came rook takes, exchanging the bishops, and in this position, if black would be impatient and play e4 right away with the idea of attacking the rook and the knight at the same time, then white would get counterplay with knight h5 starting his own attack. And that would be giving unnecessary counterplay for white. So instead of e4, black correctly continued with queen b5, simply going after white's d5 pawn. Protecting it now with the queen on e4, of course, is out of question, because then already f5 would come. White continued trying to counterattack, playing knight g5, and now h6, chasing the knight, knight h3, trying to attack the h6 pawn, but that pawn simply moves away. And now white is in serious trouble. The pawn on d5 is in trouble. The black knight is about to come in on c3, for example, after a move like rook d1. And white kind of gave up the fight. Of course, could have played the game on much longer than he did. By playing g4, these type of moves are rarely good. And black simply captured the pawn on b4, pinning that pawn on g4. White made now a move that ends the game real quick after f4, because now the fork arrived with queen d4 and it was game over. A very nice little combination for black, and it's very typical for the King's Indian or positions when black has that type of setup on the king's side with the bishop fianchettoed on g7, knight on f6 and castle, and white has opened up the diagonal by moving the b pawn ahead. So those are the important patterns to remember about this position, that the discovery of that long dark square diagonal opening and then by the e5 pawn advancing, that can work like we saw here with the first knight sacrifice and then possibly f7 to f5 chasing the rook away and e4 opening up the diagonal. So this is a very typical pattern, so try to remember it. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this endgame, black has an extra bishop, and white's only hope is if their passed pawn on the f-file could get promoted to a queen. The good news is the black king is behind the white pawn, not in front of it, so therefore it's highly unlikely that the king could ever stop the passed pawn. The trouble is, on the other hand, that black does have a bishop. And all that bishop would need to do is to control the pass of white's passed pawn, and then black would win simply. For example, if right now white would continue by capturing the pawn, black would just play d4, open up the bishop's diagonal, and then start walking with the king, eating up these pawns, and the rest would be easy. Pretty much the same would happen if white would advance the f-pawn forward without capturing the pawn. Black would play d4 and guard the next move of the pawn. Amazingly yet, white has a way to outsmart black and win the game. Try to take a little bit of time and figure it out on your own before listening further. And the answer is playing b3, keeping that bishop busy, in fact, trying to chase it away from this key diagonal. Okay, but what if the bishop just captures and remains on the diagonal? Well, we have to keep the bishop busy, remember? Play king b2, attack the bishop. Bishop can still remain on the diagonal. And now play king c3. Now the key is that if the pawn advances d5 to d4, then the c4 bishop would no longer be protected. But what if the bishop moves away? And then, after f6, black happily would give up the pawn to open up the diagonal and still have an easily won position. And here comes the key, beautiful, quiet move by blocking the pawn's way. Just king d4. And black doesn't have a way to get the bishop back timely to hold off the white pawn. Therefore, black is lost. And finally, let's see what happens if pawn captures. Obviously, pawn advances, and the black pawn arrives far too late. After f3, white promotes the pawn with a check, very importantly, and then the black pawn will never reach the promotion square because white already starts giving the checks, and then just simply step next to the pawn. It is actually quite important that white gave these last two checks and didn't play king e3 immediately in this position, because if king e3 here, then again black wins after d4, opening up the diagonal of the black bishop and then winning the queen. So white indeed did have to first give the check and another check, and then already king e3 is completely safe. A beautiful endgame composed by Eisenegger. I hope you enjoyed these interesting tactical ideas. You learn from it and use it in your own games. So long until next week. Bye-bye.